Good afternoon, everyone. All right, you get a round of applause for bearing the cold. So let's give you a round of applause for making it here this afternoon for this very special and important event. We're in the midst of a history war. We're in the midst of a battle over what history is, and specifically what American history is. Individuals like Captain Pruitt are a central part of American history. There are many people who would have us believe that the experiences of African Americans in this country are not foundational to American history. Captain Pruitt proves that to be a lie, and your presence here today proves that to be a lie. So I want to give you credit for acknowledging the importance of African American history and specifically the experiences of African Americans in the armed forces, the role of African American soldiers in shaping this country's history. And for that reason, I think there's no better person to talk about this afternoon than W.E.B. Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, truly one of the most remarkable individuals in American history. Lived an incredible life, 95 years. Born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1868, died in Accra, Ghana in 1963, literally the day before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Probably the greatest Black scholar activist in American history, the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University, the author of 22 books, single-authored books. I only got 2, so I got some work to do. Wrote in history, sociology, wrote fiction, whole range of different genres and disciplines. One of the founders of the modern civil rights movement as we know it today, was at the forefront of nearly every issue facing Black people in the United States and the African diaspora in the 20th century. So where do we begin? Where do we begin in talking about such an individual as esteemed as W.E.B. Du Bois? I want to start in October of 2000. I just started research on what would become my first book on African American soldiers and World War I, and was visiting the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where the papers of W.E.B. Du Bois are archived. I had very responsibly, in advance, gone through the finding aid and saw a reference, just a small reference, to Du Bois' World War I materials. Didn't know what it was, but I was certainly intrigued. So I go to the library special collections desk. I ask the archivist, can I see this collection, these Du Bois World War I materials? So I'm expecting maybe a folder, maybe a box if I'm really lucky. Instead, the archivist returns with 6 microfilm reels. And I don't know if anybody here is old enough to know what microfilm is. I mean, everything's digitized now, right? But you got the reels, you have to load it into this old archaic machine, right? So I start cranking the machine, right? Wondering what I'm going to see. And this is one of the first things that I saw. What I was looking at was the table of contents of an unfinished and unpublished manuscript by W.E.B. Du Bois on the Black experience in World War I, just what I was writing my book about. And this was followed by the actual manuscript and all of Du Bois's research materials and correspondence related to this project. Needless to say, once I picked my jaw up off the table, I was shocked, thrilled, overwhelmed, and quite honestly, confused. I had so many questions. What happened to this book? Why did Du Bois start writing it? What was it about? How long did he work on it? Why did it remain incomplete, unpublished, and for the most part, completely unknown? And of course, why was it even important? The story surrounding this forgotten book is truly remarkable. It's a story about the challenges of being African American. It's a story about race and democracy, about history and memory. It's a story about hope and disillusionment, faith and tragedy, determination and failure. It's a story of Du Bois in all of his brilliance and all of his flaws, wrestling with the catastrophe of war, its legacies, and the resulting historical and personal wounds. And this is the story that I tell in my book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War. So, let's begin the story. There's obviously a lot I could say about Du Bois and his background, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions about Du Bois in our Q&A. But let me just start by emphasizing that during the years of the First World War, Du Bois was at the height of his influence and arguably the most widely recognized and respected spokesman for African Americans. This was certainly reflected on the occasion of his 50th birthday, when he was feted and presented with a silver cup inscribed with the message, "From the branches of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People to W.E. Burghardt Du Bois, writer, scholar, seer," on his 50th birthday, February 23rd, 1918, given in affectionate appreciation of his great gifts and gratitude for the consecration of these gifts to the service of his race. Keep that in mind. Du Bois closely followed the World War from the opening guns of August 1914. He pinpointed the origins of the conflict in the competition amongst the European belligerents for imperial control of Africa and its people. France, England, and Belgium certainly all had blood on their hands. But thirsty for global and racial domination, Germany, in Du Bois's opinion, posed an especially grave threat to the world's darker races. The Allies had to win. So when President Woodrow Wilson addressed Congress on April the 2nd, 1917, and declared war on Germany, Du Bois, setting aside his pacifist principles, was not opposed to the United States entering the conflict. He argued that it presented an opportunity for African Americans to stake claim to their citizenship and bring meaning to Wilson's claim that the world must be made safe for democracy. Black people had fought in the past, especially harkening back to the Civil War and experiences of Black soldiers in gaining their freedom. And now they would do so again, with the hopes that the two warring ideals of being Black and being American that Du Bois famously articulated in his classic 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, would at last be reconciled. So Du Bois threw himself into the war effort, encouraging African Americans as soldiers and civilians to demonstrate their loyalty on and off the battlefield. But white supremacy tested his patriotism. Along with other African Americans, he had to reckon with moments like the unjust execution of 13 soldiers following a racial shootout in Houston, Texas, and especially the East St. Louis pogrom, July 1917, which left hundreds of Black people dead. While African Americans certainly pleaded for Woodrow Wilson to make America safe for democracy, they also demanded it, as evidenced by the silent protest parade in response to the East St. Louis massacre with Du Bois. It's kind of hard to see him in this picture, but he's marching right in the front. So when Joel Spinger, former chairman of the NAACP and one of Du Bois's closest friends, approached him in early June 1918 with an offer to become a captain in the War Department's Military Intelligence Division, Du Bois had a momentous, potentially career-defining choice to make. Du Bois knew that this appointment would arouse suspicions, but he believed that, as he wrote in a letter to the director of the Military Intelligence Division, his decision to accept this offer reflected, quote, no inconsistency with or change of attitude from my lifelong work and opinions. Indeed, he viewed his attitude as one of far-reaching patriotism. But just to make sure no lingering reservations existed about his loyalty, he wrote "Close Ranks" for the July issue of The Crisis. The Great War represented the crisis of the world, Du Bois began. He argued that however distant the war seemed, Black people had, quote, no ordinary interest in the outcome. For this reason, African Americans had to make their allegiances clear. Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy, Du Bois declared. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly with our eyes lifted to the hills. Sounds good. Close Ranks unleashed a firestorm of criticism. The Boston civil rights activist and one-time ally and close friend of Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, labeled Du Bois, among many other insults, a rank quitter of the fight for rights. From coast to coast, many African Americans branded Du Bois as self-serving at best and at worst, a traitor to the race. Now, this is Du Bois we're talking about. For a man who had committed his life to the cause of freedom and justice for Black people, no charge could be more hurtful. The Captain offer ultimately crumbled, but the uproar and damage to Du Bois's radical credentials left him deeply wounded. Du Bois's attempt to strike a grand bargain with the federal government and with American democracy itself seemed yet more misguided in light of the U.S. military's treatment of Black servicemen. Approximately 380,000 African American soldiers served in the racially segregated United States Army. The majority of Black troops in France unglamorously labored in the services of supply, loading and unloading ships, digging ditches, laying railroad tracks, burying dead bodies. The Army reluctantly agreed to the creation of two Black combat units, the 92nd Division, composed of draftees, and the 93rd Division, made up largely of Black National Guardsmen. While the 93rd Division compiled a stellar combat record, the 92nd Division became, as Du Bois later described it, quote, the storm center of the Negro troops. Racist white commanders and deliberate neglect from the War Department doomed the performance of the division from the start, while its Black officers, Du Bois's shining examples of manhood and racial leadership, endured humiliation after humiliation. African Americans can point to several notable battlefield triumphs and moments of racial pride. We were just talking about the Harlem Hellfighters a little bit ago. But for most Black soldiers, the war for democracy that Du Bois had so enthusiastically championed devolved into a personal hell. As the end of the war neared, Du Bois, his credibility tattered, his leadership in question, sat in the most precarious position of his otherwise illustrious career. Then, quite unexpectedly, an opportunity presented itself, one that would profoundly impact Du Bois's life for the next 2 decades. At the October 1918 Board of Directors meeting, the NAACP proposed that Du Bois spearhead production of a book on the history of the Black experience in the war. And he leapt at the opportunity. The scholar in Du Bois was certainly intrigued, but more importantly, here was a chance for redemption, as he saw it. As a way of demonstrating his continued ability to organize and lead, he envisioned the book as a collaborative effort. And he had 2 co-authors in mind. First, Carter G. Woodson, founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life in History, founder of Black History Month, and Emmett J. Scott, the former secretary to Booker T. Washington, famed leader of the Tuskegee Institute, who had recently served as a special assistant to the Secretary of War. But Du Bois's influence in this case had limits. Woodson, arguably the most prominent African-American historian in the nation, next to Du Bois, insisted on receiving sole credit for the project. Emmett Scott, arguably the most influential African-American in the government during the war, had plans to write his own book. So at stake was the right to call oneself the historian of the Black experience in the war and the leadership stature that went along with it. Undaunted, Du Bois set his sights on France, where, as he would later write, quote, the destinies of mankind center. On December the 1st, 1918, Du Bois departed from Hoboken, New Jersey, as part of the official press delegation, accompanying President Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference at Versailles. Du Bois spent 3 months in France. He organized a landmark Pan-African Congress in February 1919. However, his principal mission, as he put it, was to conduct research for the NAACP war history. He toured the battlefields and saw the trenches where soldiers of the 92nd Division fought in the final hours of November 11th before the armistice went into effect. He visited the encampments and experienced, as he recalled, a touch of war. Most important, he talked directly with Black soldiers and officers. With military intelligence following his every move, Du Bois absorbed tale after tale of discrimination, slander, and abuse inflicted upon Black servicemen at the hands of the American Army. A longtime friend, Matthew Virgil Boutte, served as his guide. Boutte was a captain in the 92nd Division who had been constantly humiliated by his fellow white officers, court-martialed on false charges of inefficiency, seriously injured in combat, and placed, despite his officer status, in a segregated hospital ward with regular enlisted men. He entrusted his diary to Du Bois, where in one emotional entry he wrote, "No nation on earth has ever hated a group as the Americans hate Negroes. Never in my life have I heard such an astounding series of stories," Du Bois wrote from France in a January 1919 letter to his NAACP colleagues. "You have not the faintest conception of what these men have been through. It is not only astonishing, but it will arouse every ounce of sympathetic blood in your veins." He knew what needed to be done. "I can say solemnly and without hesitation," he wrote, "the greatest and most pressing and most important work for the NAACP is the collection, writing, and publication of the history of the Negro troops in France." Du Bois returned to the United States, enraged, embarrassed, and determined. He could not help but question if his decision to encourage Black people to throw body and soul into the war effort had been worthwhile. He channeled his frustrations along with the anguish of the African-American servicemen he encountered in France into the post-war issues of the crisis. In the May 1919 issue, he informed readers about his mission in France, exposed the racism of the United States Army, and defended the honor of Black troops. The highlight of the issue, however, was returning soldiers, as his words would serve as a rallying cry for African Americans in the aftermath of the war. We return from fighting, we return fighting. History would be Du Bois's central battlefront in the struggle over the meaning of the war. Most American Negroes, do not realize that the imperative duty of the moment is to fix in history the status of our Negro troops, he wrote in an editorial announcing his plans to produce the study of the Black experience in the war. To assist in his cause, he tasked readers of the crisis and Black soldiers in particular to, quote, help in the compilation of this history. Letters, diaries, photographs, official military documents, and personal memoirs quickly flooded Du Bois's office. Du Bois promised that his book, which he tentatively titled The Negro in the Revolution of the 20th Century, would appear by the fall. Black veterans hoped that Du Bois would tell their story. Du Bois intended to serve as their voice. Generating further excitement, Du Bois published an essay toward a history of the Black man in the Great War, a tantalizing preview of the larger book he planned to write. He declared, quote, "There is not a Black soldier who is glad he went, glad to fight for France, the only real white democracy, glad to have a new, clear vision of the real inner spirit of American prejudice. The day of camouflage is past." Du Bois certainly would be severely tested throughout the summer of 1919. From Washington, D.C., to Chicago, to Phillips County, Arkansas, race riots and full-scale massacres exploded throughout the country. The number of lynchings skyrocketed. Black veterans found themselves quite literally fighting for their lives. James Weldon Johnson labeled these bloody months the Red Summer. The horror of the Red Summer was seared into Du Bois's memory, as he would remember this time as, quote, "a period of extraordinary and unexpected reaction." Du Bois used his 1920 book, Darkwater, to reflect on the war, its appalling aftermath, and his growing disillusionment. He minced no words. In the chapter titled The Souls of White Folk, Du Bois wrote, quote, "Let me say this again and emphasize it and leave no room for mistaken meaning. The World War was primarily the jealous and avarice struggle for the largest share in exploiting darker races." Du Bois also asked a remarkable question for the time. How great a failure, and a failure in what, does the World War betoken? On both a personal and intellectual level, it was a question that he had to answer. Du Bois therefore committed himself to the NAACP War Project. He devoted significant time throughout much of 1920 and into 1922, oftentimes writing late into the night. Usually went to bed around 10 p.m. He blew past his bedtime, drafting several potential chapters for what he confidently believed would be the definitive history of the Black experience in the war. Still exhilarated from his Pan-African Congresses of 1919 and also in 1921, he wrote chapters on the experiences of Black troops in the French and British armies, as well as a chapter ruminating on the future of the African diaspora in the wake of the war. Du Bois's early chapter drafts also reflected an attempt to try and find redemptive value in the global catastrophe and his place in it. This was clear in a chapter titled The Challenge, which summarized the difficult choices African Americans and himself faced in supporting the war. For a moment, and it was but a moment, it passed, but for a moment, the country seemed to rise to its mightiest stature, he wrote. Addressing his disillusionment, he reflected, "I have been called bitter. I am bitter, but here I saw all the hurts, the tears, the pain, as in one country, and that country was mine." Du Bois was glad that at least for this one brief, emancipatory moment, he could call himself an American. That he in the race could, quote, think with the nation and not as a mere group. We could rise to mighty selfishness, the nation, our country, the allies, as champions of the little hurt folk, democracy. The only way that he could explain his delusion was to plead temporary insanity. We were mad. That is the only word for it. We were mad, and let it not excuse us to say that the madness was divine. But he still refused to completely admit that he was wrong in supporting the war. How in the end did all this set with our inner problem, he pondered? After all, it was not a mere bargain, it was a moving wish. Du Bois pressed ahead to finish his book. He held out hope that despite a lack of financial support and numerous other commitments and distractions, it would soon be completed. But the worsening conditions facing African Americans and peoples of African descent throughout the diaspora caused him to further struggle with the war's individual and collective meaning. And then there was personal tragedy. In January of 1922, Du Bois lost his closest Black friend and the man who best embodied the quest to reconcile race and country, Colonel Charles Young. Young was the highest-ranking Black officer in the Army. Think of Colin Powell before there was Colin Powell. That was Charles Young. He was Black America's military hero. He had been unjustly retired from active service during the war for dubious health reasons, really to prevent him from becoming a general. It broke his heart. The Army conveniently reinstated him after the armistice and assigned him to Liberia. He died in a Nigerian hospital. Over a year after his death, Young's body was finally returned to the United States and buried with full honors in Arlington National Cemetery. But Du Bois cannot forgive the government for, as he called it, the inexcusable crime of sending Young to Liberia. Quote, "For if Charles Young's blood pressure was too high for him to go to France," Du Bois seethed in an editorial, "why was it not too high for him to be sent to the even more arduous duty in the swamps of West Africa?" This ugly reminder of the war's legacy further validated Du Bois's new title for his book, The Black Man and the Wounded World. As the title reflected, Du Bois' initial hopes of the war as a potentially revolutionary moment in the reconstruction of global race relations had evolved to an interpretation of the conflict as one of the darkest moments in modern world history. The war was a global tragedy that, along with laying the seeds for future war, strengthened white supremacy and furthered the economic exploitation of peoples of African descent. No surprise then that he described the war in the opening chapter of his book manuscript as, quote, "a scourge, an evil, a retrogression to barbarism, a waste, a wholesale murder." Du Bois's public announcement in 1924 of the Black Man in the Wounded World sparked renewed public interest in his book. Encouraged, he began writing again. And by 1926, he had drafted the bulk of his envisioned chapters. The book finally seemed on the verge of completion. But he still needed some help. He had a massive manuscript that, judged by his high scholarly and artistic standards, still required significant work. Without time and editorial assistance, he felt that he could not complete the project, at least to his satisfaction. So, seeking support, he sent inquiries to nearly every major philanthropic organization: the Rockefeller Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Slater Fund, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, the Carnegie Endowment. All expressed courteous interest, but ultimately offered their regrets. But beyond the practical obstacle of financial support, Du Bois faced an even bigger and more daunting challenge: himself. If the war he had supported was indeed a failure, as he pondered as early as 1920, with no positive outcome, then perhaps his book, languishing and in limbo, was destined for a similar fate. As he agonized over what to do with his book, many of the same veterans who had once viewed Du Bois as a savior now started to grow restless and requested the return of the personal letters, photographs, and memoirs and other ephemera that they had loaned him so many years ago. One former sergeant even threatened to take Du Bois to court to get his stuff back. Facing the threat of a lawsuit and public humiliation, Du Bois found the time to locate his items and return them, but selfishly, Du Bois kept the majority of the materials that Black veterans had sent to him. Du Bois's guilt about his decision to support the war continued to gnaw at him. In 1930, Du Bois participated in a published discussion for the magazine The World Tomorrow on the war guilt debate. This was a debate amongst historians whether or not Germany was solely responsible for the war and if American intervention was justified. In his reply to the editor, he admitted to being, quote, "swept off my feet during the World War by the emotional response of America to what seemed to be a great call to duty. The costs had been high. Instead of a war to end war or a war to save democracy, we found ourselves during and after the war descending to the meanest and most sordid of selfish actions. And we find ourselves today nearer moral bankruptcy than we were in 1914. Then surprisingly, but with a hint of a disclaimer, he admitted, quote, "I'm ashamed of my own lack of foresight. And yet war is so tremendous and terrible a thing that only those who actually experience it can know its real meaning." Du Bois was willing to acknowledge his error in supporting the war, but still sought to rationalize his decision by casting himself as one of the war's countless victims. Never content to remain unproductive, Du Bois turned to other projects, including, with the aid of a Rosenwald Fellowship, Black Reconstruction in America. The war, however, stayed firmly on his mind. He told his editor in 1931 that "I'm going to add next year as a second volume to Black Reconstruction, The Black Man in the Wounded World. That is the part which Negro troops took in the World War and its significance for the world today." Following the publication of Black Reconstruction in 1935, Du Bois returned to his long-awaited book. By this time, he began to envision The Black Man in the Wounded World as an explicit lesson about the horrors of modern warfare. A trip around the world in 1936 brought even greater clarity to the book's new significance. Du Bois spent 7 months abroad, first visiting Hitler's Germany, right in the midst of the 1936 Summer Olympics. He took the Trans-Siberian Express through the Soviet Union to the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. Then he went to China and finally ended his trip in Imperial Japan. He returned to the United States in December of 1936, literally having seen the seeds, of the next World War. The need for his book could not have been more urgent. He wanted people to see that the still open wounds from the last World War promised an even greater disaster in the near future. So in his mind, it was now or never. Hoping to finally put this project behind him, along with the ugly memory of the war itself, Du Bois reached out to the American Philosophical Society in March 1937 for funding. "I began my work in this field as a conventional study of the Negro as a soldier in the World War," he wrote. "But over time," he explained, "the whole theme has been expanding and developing in my mind, more especially since my trip around the world in 1936. If only he could have the leisure and opportunity to finish this work," he pleaded, "I think I can do something which will have influence on future knowledge with regard to war and colored people." He thought $7,500 would be enough, but the American Philosophical Society denied his request. He received one final rejection in March of 1940 from the Social Science Research Council, just as Hitler prepared for the German army to invade France. Du Bois, disillusioned, disheartened with a Second World War, a tragic reality, abandoned hopes that he would finish and publish his book. Despite an investment of more than 20 years, despite a manuscript over 800 pages in length, The Black Man in the Wounded World, Du Bois's epic history of the Black experience in the First World War, would never see the light of day. So this could very well be the end of the story. But we're left with the question of why. First, and perhaps most glaring, why didn't Du Bois finish the book? Why didn't he finish The Black Man in the Wounded World? Well, as I write about in my own book, Du Bois suffered a type of intellectual shell shock when it came to writing about and rationalizing a war defined by its irrationality. In his semi-autobiographical 1940 book, Dusk of Dawn, Du Bois wrote, quote, "In my effort to reconstruct in memory my thought and the fight of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People during the World War, I have difficulty in thinking clearly." This is Du Bois we're talking about. Du Bois never had difficulty in thinking clearly. What's going on here? He will go on to lament that, quote, "the whole history of the American Negro and other Black folk in the World War has never been written." He recalled his time in France, the mass of documents that he acquired. They deserve publication, not simply as part of the Negro's history, but as an unforgettable lesson in the spiritual lesions of race conflict during a critical period of American history. By the 1940s, it was clear that the spiritual lesions caused by the First World War had not healed. World War II confirmed the failure of World War I, as well as Du Bois's decision at the time to place his moral and political credibility on the line in encouraging Black people to close ranks and support America and the Allies. Indeed, Du Bois's own wounds had not healed as well. In a 1941 letter regarding his alma mater, Fisk University, possibly taking on a position of American preparedness to enter World War II, Du Bois wrote, quote, "I have lived through one period of deliberate and prolonged propaganda for war and partially succumbed to it," adding, "I have lived to know better, and my opposition to war under any circumstances has been immeasurably increased." But even up to the final years of his life, Du Bois still sought to understand why he had supported the war in the first place. "I felt for a moment, as the war progressed, that I could be without reservation a patriotic American," Du Bois wrote, now in his 80s, in his autobiography that was posthumously published in 1968. "I'm not sure that I was right, but certainly my intentions were. I did not believe in war, but I thought that in a fight with America against militarism and for democracy, we would be fighting for the emancipation of the Negro race. With the armistice came disillusion. That disillusion stayed with Du Bois until his death on August 27, 1963, in Accra, Ghana. The war consumed Du Bois. It confounded him. He could not make sense of it as both personal and historical moment. He was unable to muster the intellectual fortitude and, dare I say, the moral strength necessary to complete his book. His failure embodied the tragedy and failure of the war that he struggled to write about. And in this sense, the Black man in the wounded world was Du Bois himself. But we're also left with the question of, why does this story matter? Why does this story matter? Well, it matters because, obviously, Du Bois matters. Anything about Du Bois matters, right? He remains arguably the greatest Black intellectual this country has ever produced. But just as rightly as we celebrate his genius, we must also understand his humanity. Someone who hoped and dreamed, someone capable of making the wrong decision, someone capable even of failure, but someone who changed. The failure of World War I and ultimately the failure to complete The Black Man in the Wounded World were essential to his political evolution and his radicalism. By the late 1940s, he became a staunch peace activist and, in the eyes of the federal government, in the midst of the Cold War, a distinct threat. In 1951, he was indicted and tried on charges of being a foreign agent. He won an acquittal, but the ordeal and subsequent seizure of his passport by the government were a painful reminder that for a Black person, criticizing America and fighting for peace came with tremendous risk and cost. In his 1952 book, In Battle for Peace, Du Bois wrote, quote, As then a citizen of the world, as well as of the United States of America, I claim the right to know and think and tell the truth as I see it. I believe in socialism as well as democracy, he wrote. But above all else, he emphasized, I hate war. But the story I tell in my book, I think, also goes beyond Du Bois. It reveals to us the impact of World War I on African Americans, how it exposed the core tensions of African American identity, and how it shaped the history of racial struggle in the 20th century and up to the present. For Du Bois, the history of World War I was not simply an intellectual challenge. It was a profoundly personal, moral, and ethical challenge as well. It still is. Du Bois understood that the history of the war was deeply bound with the political status of Black people, the future of democracy, and the condition of the world we live in. And it still is. More than a century after the First World War, many of the same struggles Du Bois confronted: white supremacy, fascism, wealth inequality, government assaults on history and the truth, exorbitant spending on the military, preparation for endless war. All of these remain urgent matters today. Du Bois, through his life, his work, and his voice, has indeed tasked us with fighting for democracy and working with all of our strength to heal our still very wounded world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring and enlightening presentation. I had the honor of visiting in Ghana Du Bois's library collection, and based on all of the great information you've given us today, what would you say, speaking toward the psychological state of Black America and maybe Blacks in the diaspora, how you cannot have this double consciousness that we've often heard and read about, that we experience living in America? A man as dedicated as Dr. Du Bois was toward finding the undercurrents of truth in this double consciousness, what do you say that Black people today have a psychological instability, because you can't have it both ways? And Du Bois left America. He gave up all of this stuff and got out of town. Yeah. And so what would you say, looking at the big picture of Black people, period, how can we peacefully and sanely coexist in a situation that he found himself in his experiences he couldn't handle it? What do you say about the rest of us?
Yeah, we're in trouble. Yeah, all right. So you're referring to Du Bois's classic formulation in The Souls of Black Folk, where he writes about this two-ness of being Black and being American, this double consciousness, these two warring ideals, as he put it, trapped in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, right? And I think you're right. He is, on the one hand, talking about a psychological condition, right? This sense of a hybrid identity, right? And his belief at the time that it was possible, right, to merge these two aspects of African American identity, right, into one singular identity that would be respected and accepted, which would allow Black people to fully live up to their human potential, right? I think as Du Bois aged over the years, right? And again, it's important to remember that Du Bois lived a very long time, right? He lived through a lot. He saw a lot. He experienced a lot. His skepticism about the possibilities of what America could be, what it could achieve as far as the place and condition of Black people increased, all right? And he does decide to leave the United States and live out the rest of his life in Ghana. But even in doing so, and I think this is important to emphasize, Du Bois never fully abandoned America. He never abandoned the idea of America, and he never abandoned the contributions of Black people to America. He understood that America could not be what it was and what it could potentially be without Black people, without our history, without our service, without our sacrifice, right? And I think that's important to hold on to recognize, right? But to also not place all of our faith in America, right? To really think about those two aspects of our identity, what it means to be a person of African descent, but also what it means to be American, right? And to give equal weight to both of those, right? To not feel like we need to subsume who we are and all of the beauty of our identity under an American identity, which historically has not proven to be fully rewarding. Maybe that's what Du Bois would say. I don't know.
I too, as a gentleman ahead of me, just salute you for your precise analysis of W.B. Du Bois. My question, which was for me a contradiction on another issue, which with the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. Do you think, or in your study, did he regret his positions of attacking the Honorable Marcus Garvey?
No.
He never.
He hated Garvey.
Okay. And it's ironic that, he was speaking out against Garvey about the whole concept of moving to Africa. And, Garvey never did move, and he ended up living there. And like the gentleman ahead, I've been to that center also. Yeah. So one last thing then, and it was ironic this morning, I saw a documentary on the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. I don't know, I came in a little late. Did you address them too?
Sure. So just in terms of Marcus Garvey, Marcus Garvey was a fellow Pan-Africanist. His vision of Pan-Africanism was very different from Du Bois's. Marcus Garvey, provisional president of Africa, as he dubbed himself, leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, without question, one of the, if not the most important mass organization of Black people in the early 20th century, right? The legacies of the UNIA are still with us today, right? Du Bois recognized Garvey as a very important leader, but a rival as well, right? And his rival visions of Pan-Africanism, his rival visions of Black leadership was something that Du Bois was fundamentally opposed to. And it got really nasty and personal between both of them. And he made no apologies for his criticism of Garvey. And of course, the irony is that Du Bois actually does go to Africa and lives out his final days in Nkrumah's Ghana, which was in some ways inspired by Garvey and the UNIA, right? The Black Star. Right? So I think that history, Du Bois as a Pan-Africanist, is a really important part of his story, which connects to his experience in World War I. Thinking about World War I really as the genesis of modern day Pan-Africanism in that 1919 moment.
Did you happen to go to the 7th Pan-African Congress that was held in Uganda, which I was able to attend?
I did not, no. Okay. No, I didn't. As far as the Harlem Hellfighters, the New York 15th National Guard, the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Rattlers, they had a lot of different names. Without question, the most acclaimed and probably most famous regiment of African Americans in World War I. They were part of the 93rd Division, which was made up, as I said, largely of Black National Guardsmen. Compiled of Black men from New York City and in the surrounding New York area. James Reese Europe was their band leader. He helped introduce jazz to France and to the world. They have a remarkable story. Served for 191 consecutive days on the Western Front and didn't cede an inch of territory to the German army. They actually served in the French military. Because the United States didn't know what to do with this weird consortium of Black National Guardsmen, so they literally gave the 93rd Division over to the French Army as opposed to having them serve in the American Expeditionary Forces, which probably was a blessing in disguise because they were allowed to demonstrate their abilities and their manhood on the battlefield, right? And Du Bois, he knew many of these men personally. New York City was a small, tight-knit circle, so he knew their stories, and he planned to write about them in his book. As important as the Harlem Hellfighters are, there's a much larger history about the experiences of Black soldiers in the war, which is not as easily romanticized as the Harlem Hellfighters, as the 369th, right? Stories that Pete Hegseth is not going to talk about, quite frankly, okay? And Du Bois was going to tell those stories. He was going to present the raw, unfiltered history of the Black experience in the war, which in part explains why he had so much trouble getting financial support for it, right? No one wanted to write about the history of the war and American history in that type of way, right? Which is part of the tragedy of Du Bois not finishing his book, but quite frankly was part of my motivation in wanting to write about it and have Du Bois's story told.
Thanks so much, Professor Williams. Tremendous talk. I'm just struggling. One of the things that I so admire about W. Du Bois is just that he was such a fierce observer of the American condition. And the thing that I struggle with in regards to this context is that, pre-World War I, Jim Crow is deeply entrenched. Woodrow Wilson was racist and segregated the government or resegregated the government. Lynchings were prevalent even before Red Summer, well before Red Summer. And
all of those special grievances.
All those special grievances. Yeah. So what was the countervailing facts on the ground that made W.E.B. Du Bois go so far as to wholeheartedly endorse the war? I mean, what specific facts on the ground were giving him some concrete sense of hope?
I think you said it, hope. And I think we have to take hope seriously. That's something that I tried to do in my book. I have the book structured into 3 parts: hope, disillusion, and failure, right? Du Bois hoped, along with many other intellectuals, right, all over the world, that this was going to be a transformative moment in world history and in the history of democracy, right? So he wasn't really an outlier in that respect. Yeah, you have, certainly a very vocal and anti-war political community, which gave it to Du Bois. But, he was also, I think, part of a moment, right, in thinking about what the war could potentially be. But what it could potentially mean for Black people and other peoples of African descent. I think this is why history matters, right? Du Bois saw war and the Black experience in the war as an engine of potentially revolutionary social transformation and political transformation, right? He was a student of history, right? He was a student of military history. I don't think we really think about Du Bois as like the military historian that he was in many respects, right? So he's very familiar with the historical contributions of African Americans to the American Revolution, right? Especially the Civil War, right? In some ways that was his frame of reference, right? Where you have Black soldiers serving in the Union Army who transformed the course of the war and achieve freedom, the destruction of slavery, right? He's thinking about the World War in that historical continuum, but even on a grander scale, right? And I think Du Bois also was caught up in the moment of being an American, the propaganda of the war, right? Just the fierce engine of American propaganda and hyper-Americanism. Du Bois believed, like his good friend, Colonel Charles Young believed, that it was perhaps possible to serve both race and country, right? And to do so, right, in one dark body, to use his language from the souls of Black folk, right? So I think he genuinely believed in his heart of hearts that this was going to be a different outcome. He very quickly realizes that that's not going to be the case. And I think he has to rationalize, or at least attempt to rationalize his decision, right? And all of the horrific things that came out of it, right? You know, in a way that he only could write a book about it, right? But ultimately, it was still too difficult and too painful for him to fully articulate and to bring it all together. Right? So yeah, so I think you're asking kind of the critical question: how could Du Bois be so wrong? Some of this, right?
And if I could just ask a very brief follow-up to that, Professor. I mean, so that bringing up the Civil War as a frame of reference for him is very helpful. There were concrete truths for Blacks after the war.
Absolutely, yeah.
But was there something that was happening in 1910, 11, 12, 13, in that specific time period that provided him a basis that, despite all the terrible things that were happening to African Americans, there was still some fruits of progress that could be made?
Well, I mean, he was part of the NAACP, right? And he was part of, he helped co-found the Niagara movement. So he was part of an incipient civil rights movement, right? A civil rights struggle. He believed in his own abilities, right? His own intellectual abilities, the power of his voice to change minds, right? He's certainly growing much more skeptical of kind of the social scientific rationality that shaped much of his early career. But he still believed in the power of his pen, right? The power of his ideas. And he thought that, he could make a difference, through his voice and through his activism as well. So you're seeing kind of the beginnings of, what we think of today as the modern civil rights movement happening, after 1909, when the NAACP is founded, the beginnings of the legal efforts to challenge Jim Crow, specifically spearheaded by the NAACP. In other organizations, you have the beginnings of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. So you have some demographic changes happening as well. So, there's things are changing. But I think at its core, it was Du Bois's belief in the potential of democracy and the potential of Black people serving in the military and fighting for democracy that was going to make the ultimate difference. Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. And we had a little talk earlier, and I'm so happy you mentioned In Battle for Peace by Du Bois when he worked with the Peace Information Center as possibly some kind of response to his earlier commitment to war, which is the subject here. But Du Bois made it absolutely clear that he was committed to two things. That is, those two things being he was a communist and he was a Pan-Africanist. And how do you think that has any relevance today with the wars that we witness today, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, according to what he would advise us to do?
Again, I mean, I hate to speak on Du Bois's behalf because he would probably tell me I was totally wrong in what I was saying. But Du Bois was certainly, by the end of his life, all of those things that you said. He was a communist, unapologetically. He was a Pan-Africanist, right? But he was also an anti-war activist. I think that's so important to keep in mind, right? The reason why the government is going after him in 1951 is because of his activities with the Peace Information Center, right? Because he's going all over the world attending peace conferences, including in the Soviet Union, right? So he's on the federal government's radar, like Paul Robeson also was, and a number of other black radicals during the 1950s, right, in the midst of the Cold War Red Scare. So one of the things I really wanted to try and do in this book is to give us some type of explanation, a possible explanation of how Du Bois starts out in 1918 telling black folks to close ranks. But by 1951, he's about to go to jail, 83 years old, right, for his anti-war activities. That's a remarkable evolution and transformation, right? So in terms of what Du Bois would tell us today, he would tell us that he hates war. That under any circumstances and any conditions, war is not the answer to solve our human problems. And he might very well remind us that we can't understand what's happening around the world, whether we're talking about in Ukraine, whether we're talking about in Gaza, without going back to World War I. The foundation for many of our current global crises, right?
Thank you for your time, and thank you for allowing me to be the last question. My question is, what do you say to people who talk about history as a hindrance to progression? And the mindset behind we should be happy that we have, like Eddie Murphy and, successful black people. We got Snoop Dogg, that talking about history could be a hindrance to progression. Right. Which I don't agree with, but I would love to hear your point of view.
I'm forgetting the exact moment, but there's an incident that Du Bois talks about when he was writing one of his books, or it was an article, and one of the editors told him to take out some of the history, that there was too much history in it. And Du Bois writes, I wanted to, I'm paraphrasing, right? I wanted to grab him by his lapels and shake him and tell him, you jackass, history is what is most important. That if there is no history, there's nothing, right? So, yeah. History is the foundation of how we reckon with our identity. Our individual identities, as well as our collective identities, right? As a country, right? James Baldwin said that American history is more beautiful. Oh God, I'm messing up the quote, right? Is more beautiful and more terrible than anyone has ever written about. Something along those lines, right? So I think the challenge that we have to face, especially in this moment, is embracing the beauty and the terror of history, right? Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.